What is going on, YouTube? Gabmus here, and welcome to the 41st episode of the Tech Pills live stream, or 41st, whatever. So let's start with the first news of today. Ubuntu gets a new installer written in Flutter. What's going on here? So let's start off with what was happening before this new thing. So Ubiquiti is the bespoke installer of Ubuntu. It's been there for, well, forever really. It's been there since 2006, and it's, well, pretty old and crusty at this point. It works, it has its quirks, and being such an old project, the code base is probably complex enough to justify a rewrite. The weird thing is that for whatever reason, they decided to use Flutter, of all things, to rewrite the Ubuntu installer. Flutter, if you don't know, is an open source cross-platform UI toolkit developed by Google that uses the Dart programming language, again by Google, for writing applications. My first thought when I heard this news was, why? Well, we have GTK, Qt, and many other lesser known but still decent toolkits in the Linux land, and so why of all of these toolkits did Canonical choose to use Flutter? I don't really love the idea personally, but I guess it doesn't really make too much sense to complain, because as long as it works, it's fine. It's the installer. You probably are ever gonna see it once in the lifetime of your computer. If everything goes well between distribution upgrades, it's unlikely that you will see it it's unlikely that you will see it a lot. So it really doesn't really matter too much what language it's written in. It's still quite a weird choice, in my opinion, from Canonical side. The only possible reason that I could think of why they chose Flutter may have to do with the fact that it can run inside a web browser. Maybe this can be a way to introduce at some point in the future a graphical installer for Ubuntu server or other headless versions of Ubuntu. So that you can simply launch the installer from the browser from another computer and then just install your headless Ubuntu version from like a graphical user interface. All in all, I'm just happy to see that they will be replacing Ubiquiti. Again, it's pretty old and it does have its quirks. One of the things that always drives me crazy is that at some point during the installation, before you do anything that actually writes stuff to the disk, Ubiquiti just freezes for quite a while. It's a couple of minutes or so. You have the application completely frozen, and for a new user, yeah, I mean, this thing has been, this bug, because it's obviously a bug, has been there forever, at least as long as I can remember. So I know that it's there, and I know that when the Ubuntu installer freezes, and I know where it freezes, it's always happening, no matter the machine. If I'm running on physical hardware or on a virtual machine, the Ubuntu installer always freezes. Dominic, the Fern OS dev, says hi. Hey there. Glad you could make it to the live stream. So this is one of the worst quirks of the Ubuntu installer, this freeze thing. And I don't really know what's happening there. I don't really know why this is happening, but it's one of those paper cuts that you experience with such an old piece of software. I'm pretty sure that once they rewrite the whole thing, these problems are going to be gone. Hopefully, if they are not, then there's probably something wrong somewhere else other than Ubiquiti. I don't think this is the case. I think that they will solve all these problems. It's probably just that the code base is quite complex and articulated at this point. Think of a spaghetti mess. So a rewrite is probably the easiest option even at this point. So the real interesting thing here, well, I mean, this is already pretty interesting, but I'm also curious to see what will Ubuntu derivatives do, starting from Kubuntu, Xubuntu, and so on, and ending like with distributions like Linux Mint. Will they adopt the new installer, or they will stick with Ubiquity, or possibly they will go somewhere else? These are very interesting questions. I still probably there are no official information about what other distributions will do. I'm pretty sure that at least up until the next LTS, they will stick to Ubiquity, and then with the next LTS, there will probably be a change of some sort to something else. I wouldn't be shocked to see many distributions going to something like Calamares. Calamares is a distribution agnostic sort of graphical installer, and it's famously used by distributions like Manjaro, and I'm pretty sure even Endeavor OS uses Calamares, but even distributions that are not based on Arch use Calamares. I think that for a period of time Kubuntu used Calamares. Probably they still do. I'm not sure about that, but I know that Calamares is in fact distribution agnostic. It needs some work to work on different distributions, of course. It's I mean, whoever the developer that actually wants to use Calamares has to do some work to actually adapt it to the distribution, but it does make sense. So I wouldn't be shocked to see distributions like, say, Linux Mint move to Calamares or something similar for their installer. All right, moving on to the next news of today. A Microsoft repository and a GPG key have been silently added to Raspberry Pi OS. So the community has made quite a huge noise about this news, and honestly, I kind of have to agree with the community on this. Let's jump to the chat real quick. Dominic says, I mean, it's Calamares, Qt, Ubiquity, Qt, GTK, or new installer, Google Toolkit, whatever it's called. The new installer, I don't think it has a name yet. It's based on Flutter. Flutter is the toolkit, so yeah, I'm pretty sure that you only have these three options, and Ubiquity is going end of life after all. So, I mean, Linux Mint has Linux Mint Debian installer. Do they? I didn't know that, so they can just use that in Mint. I didn't know about this. I don't really care too much about Linux Mint Debian edition because it never really worked for me. It was always kind of weird in its own way. I never really fully liked it, so I never gave it too much thought. But it's, well, I know that most of the reason why they do have a Debian edition is for fallback. Say Ubuntu goes away one day or another, they have a Debian based distributions already. They can move the main Linux Mint to that. So I think that it does make sense for this kind of thing that they have different stuff in the Debian edition, so that if something in Ubuntu goes away and moves to something that they don't like, they can just bring whatever they were using in the Debian edition, bring it to the regular edition. So really does make sense that they have like this separation, and they will probably at this point use the installer from the Debian edition. Thanks for the insight. Let's just say it kind of looks like a ripoff of Unity of sorts, of Ubiquity of sorts. Yeah, many installers look really similar to Ubiquity, but there are only so many ways you can install a Debian-based operating system, or a Linux distribution for that matter. So, I mean, they all kind of look the same. It's the underlying functionality that differs between one another. So as I was saying, a Microsoft repo and GPG key have been added to Raspberry Pi OS. The community made a huge deal about this. I kind of have to agree with them because, okay, let's just explain the story here real quick. With the recent update to Raspberry Pi OS, so your normal updates, you do sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade, because Raspberry Pi OS is based on Debian, so you have to use apt. After an upgrade, many users started seeing a new repository in their system. And it's not like they were notified about this in any way. It just so happened that I'm pretty sure a Reddit user was browsing their repositories and suddenly found this effectively repository pointing to Microsoft servers. Again, this was a silent and unnotified change. This repository wasn't there before this update. And the reason why it was added was because apparently the Raspberry Pi Foundation wanted to give users a quick way to install Visual Studio Code, which is all the rage these days. If you don't know what it is, Visual Studio Code is a text editor for programming. Of course, it's not limited to that. It's a text editor. You can edit text. That's most of what it does. It's quite popular. It's semi-proprietary in the sense that it has an open source core and has like some sort of something else on top of it, which is proprietary. Dominic says, only thing I'm really peeved with is people making a big deal about it being Microsoft instead of being a big deal about Raspberry Pi Foundation doing it silently. Yes, the problem really here isn't Microsoft, because they're doing their thing. They've always been doing their thing and whatever. So the problem here is from the side of the Raspberry Pi Foundation. It doesn't really have to do too much with Microsoft itself, because we know Microsoft as a company, we know what they do, we know their business model, or at least part of it, and we know that they do profit from collecting user data. So it's not like they do have any control over Raspberry Pi OS or the repositories, or at least they did not up to this point, where the Raspberry Pi Foundation decided to include a Microsoft repository inside Raspberry Pi OS. Dominic again says, so of course, a lot of people like to make this, therefore, seem like it's Microsoft bad instead of Raspberry Pi Foundation bad. Yes, you make a fair point here, because it's important to point out that the biggest offender in this story is actually the Raspberry Pi Foundation. Anyway, let's move on with what I was saying. So they included these repositories, the Raspberry Pi Foundation, to be able to distribute Visual Studio Code to its users in an easy way. This probably goes hand in hand with the fact that they recently released the Raspberry Pi Pico. We talked about it in the last episode. If you want to check it out, it's episode 40. So considering that Visual Studio Code has all of the tooling and is the suggested text editor by the Raspberry Pi Foundation to actually write software for the Raspberry Pi Pico, kind of makes sense that they wanted to include that. Still, I'm not really I do not really agree with their decision, with the not just with their decision, but with the way that they decided to go about this. Let's talk about it. Visual Studio Code is partly open source, so it has an open source core. You can download that, you can compile it, and you can run it on your system. It's not quite that easy, but there are forks of Visual Studio Code, at least the open source part, that are fully open source and do not have any of the Microsoft telemetry and data collection and all that kind of stuff that nobody really wants. So there are forks. Notably, VS Codium and Code OSS are two very famous ones. Again, Dominic says, last peeve I have with those people, them saying that they're betraying open source when they're education-centric, not open source-centric. Okay, I see what you're saying. I would agree in saying that the Raspberry Pi Foundation is not really a free software steward or a free software. They're not really too centered on the fact that they're distributing open source software and sort of open source hardware. It's not really open hardware. It's close. It's as close as you probably can get up to this point. But yeah, I mean, it's not like they're going around saying that they are, like, I don't know, the Free Software Foundation proposing. evangelizing for free software or whatever. They're not doing any of that. As you said, they're very focused on the education market and on bringing like technology to the masses, technology education to the masses, so that kids can understand how a computer works, how basic programming works, how can they build simple robots and all that kind of stuff. So it's not really, they probably didn't think too much about this in the first place. And in fact, I did want to say this: this move, I don't think this move is malicious from the side of the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I don't think that they had any ill intent. They probably just wanted to. They probably just wanted people to be able to easily install Visual Studio Code on the Raspberry Pi OS. And I mean, they're totally. I mean, this move, if it was any other operating system, if it was, I don't know, Lenovo pre-installing Visual Studio Code on their Windows laptops, nobody would really think about this. It wouldn't really make it into the news, probably. The problem here is that many users of Raspberry Pi OS are Linux users, and they do care about free software. They care about open source as a movement and free software as an ideal, and they do care about privacy, and they don't really want have anything to do with Microsoft. What the Raspberry Pi Foundation could have done could have been including one of the Visual Studio Code forks, the open source ones, into the repositories and package it themselves. They could have done that. They didn't. Probably they didn't even think about it in the first place. Or alternatively, they could have pointed to another way of installing Visual Studio Code, like using Flatpak or Snap, which is very, very convenient for this kind of software, because it puts everything isolated inside a sandbox of sorts, so they can only do so much harm compared to if you have it installed in your whole operating system. And the other very important thing that I wanted to say is that with the addition of this repository and a GPG key that the system automatically trusts, this means that in theory, Microsoft could push whatever software they want to Raspberry Pi OS users without them even noticing. They can really just replace a system package and inject it with malware, with spyware of some sort, with whatever they want, because they are in control of the repository and they're in control of that GPG key that is trusted by Raspberry Pi OS. So if users do not manually disable this repository and the related GPG key, what could happen is that at some point Microsoft, or even if not Microsoft, you can decide to trust them, but if something goes wrong and Microsoft gets hacked, of course everyone can get hacked. If you're trusting like a third-party repository, and at some point that repository and the related GPG key gets they both get hacked, you can get infected with malicious software. So that's always a possibility. But just for the sake of the argument, since it's Microsoft, it's a big company, it's not rare that these big companies are easy targets for big massive attacks. Also considering like the recent news with SolarWinds and all that kind of stuff, everyone was affected basically by those attacks. So let's say if Microsoft gets hacked and the control of the repository and the GPG keys falls into the wrong hands, what could happen is that you can get, this Microsoft repository can be a vector for more dangerous malware than just spyware controlled by Microsoft. Dominic again says, yeah, but I'd require the people with the GPG key in the first place to sign those, which would leave them liable to some potential sues. But yeah, to be fair, getting hacked is indeed a possibility. Yeah, again, this is more like a far-fetched scenario. It's not really too likely to happen. And if it does happen, it's not like it's it's a thing that could only happen to Microsoft. It could happen to any distribution maintainer that has a GPG key that is trusted in many users' systems and with many repositories out there for various different distributions. My point here is that it's I agree with the community. We shouldn't trust Microsoft because at the end of the day, they do get that profiling, that telemetry data from just having the repository installed in your system. It's not even necessary that you have Visual Studio Code installed in your system, because every time you update, you ping all of the servers that you have installed, that you have listed, all the repositories that you have listed as whenever you update or you install software, you always ping all of the servers that are listed as repositories in your system. That includes the Microsoft repository. So their server gets effectively pinged with your IP every time you perform a remote apt operation. So that means installing and updating your system. I wouldn't really want to give this data to Microsoft because I don't think that they don't offer me anything valuable in return for this for this data that I would give them. I personally don't use Microsoft products, so this doesn't really affect me. But and I don't even have a Raspberry Pi running Raspberry Pi OS at this point. But if I did, I would disable this just because one, I don't use Visual Studio Code, and two, because I don't want Microsoft to have this information about me. I don't want Microsoft to gain money on my behalf using my data and my information, because they didn't do anything for Linux at all. You can go about with the Microsoft Love Linux whatever thing, but I don't really believe in that, because what you're seeing with Microsoft Loves Linux and this whole movement is Microsoft incorporating Linux into their operating system because they know that Linux has a technical advantage over Windows. So of course they want to gain those users that migrated from Windows to Linux. They want to gain them back, and Windows Subsystem for Linux is one of those things that they're doing to gain those users back. Also, Visual Studio Code, the Edge browser, the only reason they have these products in the first place is because they can gain money from them. Because even if they're free, as in beer, so it's free in cost, they do gain money because every time you use those software, you're constantly sending Microsoft lots of telemetry data and metadata and all kinds of stuff that they can use to monetize on your behalf. And anything that would really make Linux compete with Windows in fields that they couldn't otherwise compete, like for instance, you having the possibility to install Microsoft Office on Linux. I know that somewhat Microsoft is working on it, but it's based on virtual machines. It's a very complicated mess, and I'm not really sure if they're serious about this. But up to this point, there's no Microsoft Office for Linux, and even if there was, it would still be probably paid software. And even if it wasn't, it would still send telemetry data back to them. So would make sense for them to want as much data, as much telemetry data as possible. And something else, if you don't really care about Microsoft Office, and I understand that you wouldn't, because LibreOffice is a thing, and honestly it's better than Office on so many levels. So there are also other software that are better than both Office and LibreOffice. Sorry for that. Other projects, other pieces of software like DirectX. DirectX has never been available for Linux, and it will never be, probably, at this point. Why? Because it's a Microsoft technology and they want exclusivity on it. Guess what? We don't really care anymore, because we have things like the XVK and VKD3D that run circles around DirectX in any of its implementations. So we don't really have to care anymore for anything Microsoft. They can keep their garbage, they can keep it in-house, they can have it. We don't care. I don't care. I use my Linux system with Linux software, with open source and free software. And even the software that I use there, it's not free. And of course, I'm referring to free as in freedom. Doesn't really have the kind of access that Microsoft would have on such a system. The only real big proprietary softwares that I use are Steam and Steam games. And honestly, Steam and Valve have been great with Linux. I mean, I know that Steam isn't open source, but Valve is doing great work with the community. They're upstreaming lots of code, and they're contributing to the Linux kernel. Particularly, like in the latest news, if you heard, they have paid. They are collaborating with Collabora. Sorry for the pun. For creating a for modifying the Linux kernel so that they can create an effective compatibility layer for anti-cheat software to run under Proton. So they're effectively doing lots of work to make Linux a viable platform for gaming. And of course, we're talking about gaming here because that's really what Steam is all about. All of the technology world is not all about gaming, but that's a big part of it. And as far as Valve is concerned, Steam and Valve are focused on gaming, so that's what they're trying to bring to Linux, and that's just great. A company like Microsoft only thinks about Linux and wants to do stuff with Linux because they can monetize it, they can gain money from it, and when it's no longer of any use to them, they can just discard it and forget about it. They haven't shown anything as far as Linux friendliness goes. The only thing that they've been doing is honestly nothing. They're trying to steal what we have, and to some extent they are succeeding. Of course, they cannot truly succeed because the truth about Linux is it's not just about having like a terminal and all the tools. It's also about the freedom. It's also about the control that you have on your system and the ownership. You own your system. This went off to a pretty weird tangent, so sorry about that. All I wanted to say, Raspberry Pi Foundation, bad. You shouldn't have done this. If you are using Raspberry Pi OS and do not like this change that they introduced, consider switching to another distribution. There are lots of distributions for the Raspberry Pi. Many, they're also better than Raspberry Pi OS. So moving on to the next news of today. Firefox is preparing for a big redesign, and it's called Proton. It's not really the best name, considering that Proton is another thing in the Linux world, but whatever. So they're creating a new design. Here it is. You're probably seeing it right now. I don't like it. I don't really like it. As you see here, they are switching to these kind of visually isolated tabs. They're pretty high here. I mean, the height is pretty consistent, but they can be made smaller with just a small change in the preferences, so it doesn't really matter too much. I just think it doesn't look really all that great. And the other part of the redesign is the new hamburger menu here on the right. This I don't really mind too much. It's decent. It's prettier than it was before. Maybe would need a little bit of work, but it's not bad. And besides, it's not all that different from what we currently already have on Firefox. These new tabs, though, I don't really like them. I kind of hate them, to be honest. And I've always liked weird Firefox redesigns. This is probably the first one that I really don't like. But it doesn't really matter too much. This is the new design. What's going to replace your regular square tabs in Firefox. But guess what? I don't really use Firefox this way. This is what my Firefox looks like. And what you may think is, well, that looks a whole lot like GNOME Web. It does. It does because it's using a theme, a CSS theme for Firefox called Firefox GNOME theme. So disclaimer: this is a pretty complex thing that I'm doing here. It can break and it can make your browser, if not unusable, at least unstable-ish, or some things may not work at some point. So you have to know what you're doing here if you want to replicate my setup. This is Firefox GNOME theme, made by Rafael Mardojai. I'm sorry, I'm butchering your surname. Anyway, I will leave the link for this in the chat right now, so you can check it out. Let's jump to the chat real quick. Dominic says the tabs are looking kind of thick. Yeah, I mean, again, the thickness is not really that big of a deal because you can change that in the settings. What really bothers me is that it disconnects from the rest of the page. Let's look at it again. It's disconnected from the rest of the window of the page. It's isolated. It's a white thing between other stuff that doesn't really work design wise, in my opinion. Mazed says, I don't like the tabs either. Oh, and have you all noticed missing item from the menu called customize? Is it missing? Huh, you're right. It's not there. Probably you can find it either under more tools or under settings, or probably if you just right click on the toolbar and you usually have an option called customize if you right click on the toolbar in Firefox. So I don't think that it's gone. I don't think it's gone. I think it's just moved somewhere else. My best bet is under more tools. Anyways, I was saying, sorry. This is the Firefox GNOME theme, and it's a theme for Firefox that makes it look like GNOME Web or Epiphany. I think it looks pretty good, and there are many other Firefox CSS themes out there that you can install in your system to make Firefox look different. Firefox can look a whole lot better compared to what it does now and what it will look like in the close future. Dominic says the only way you can access customize in the redesign is right-clicking in the toolbar currently. So yeah, this was my guess. I'm pretty sure that they will introduce it back in the hamburger menu because it doesn't really make sense that they left it out. I don't know. Let's see where that goes. Anyway, as long as the option is there, it doesn't really matter too much to me. One other thing that I wanted to show you about my Firefox, so one thing that I really don't like about Firefox now or with the Proton redesign, whatever, is the home page, like the new tab page. You can see it right now. It's not great. It has these suggested posts recommended by Pocket. It has kind of ads things in here. I don't really like it. It looks ugly in my opinion, and it shows content that I don't really want to see. I've been playing around with different new tab extensions from time to time in my Firefox, up to the point that I was fed up with whatever I was using because nothing really fitted my my use cases, and I decided to write my own. So here it is. This is Bookmarks Speed Dial. That's how I called it. It's a very simple Firefox extension that takes some bookmarks folders in your Firefox bookmarks and shows them as nice tiles like this. It's very simple. The tiles, the actual art for the tiles is kind of hard-coded. I have to support a particular site to make it show up inside the new tab. So you cannot add your own tiles to this up to this point. I will probably do something about it in the near future. I'm not really sure at this point. I made this for myself, so of course I made it, and I made it open source, and I published it. You can find it in the add-ons store for Firefox. I will leave a link in the chat. And you can install it in your Firefox. You can use it. It's very simple. And if you need, like, if you use a website that doesn't have an icon, you can request it via the GitLab repository, and I will do my best to include it in the extension. Or you can also open a merge request if you prefer to do it that way. This really goes to show you how easy it is to customize Firefox. This is a very, very simple extension. It's a few lines of HTML, a few lines of JavaScript, not really all that much in here. Frankly, honestly, I think it looks pretty good, and it makes my browser experience a whole lot better. And more importantly, I don't have to deal with the ugly mess that Firefox is becoming. So there's that. Of course, this is all personal preference. You may love the new redesign. I don't. But it's nice that we have the possibility to change how Firefox looks and behaves, because we do not have that possibility with many other software out there, including the main competition to Firefox, which is Google Chrome or Chromium. All right, let's jump to the next news of today. Let's talk about the command line and our beloved terminal. This section has been inspired by the second latest episode of the DLN Extend podcast, where Matt, Wendy, and Nate talked about GUI versus CLI. The Linux community is quite split on this. On the one hand, we're probably one of the only ones, like in the whole computing world, to have a terminal keyboard shortcut by default in our OS. And even distributions like Ubuntu have this thing built in. You press Ctrl, Alt, and T and you open a terminal. No other OS except Linux has this kind of thing. Maybe BSD, I mean, you know what I mean. On the other hand, we always talk about how new users shouldn't touch the terminal since they get intimidated by it and run away crying from Linux. This is really something that I just recently came to a different conclusion, because I was one of those people that said you don't have to touch the terminal. You will not ever touch the terminal. And to some extent, a new Linux user, or well, a Linux user period, can live their Linux user life without ever having to open the terminal. Should they live a life like this? I don't think they do. Let's get this straight. The terminal isn't difficult. And probably you already know this. It's just different. So there are many ways to interact with a computer. We have many different kinds of computers these days. You can either use the traditional method. You can use a mouse and a keyboard with some mouse movements, right-click menus, keyboard shortcuts like the usual, I don't know, Control-C, Control-V, Control-Z, the normie stuff. You can use a laptop that has a touchpad with multi-finger gestures. That's very handy. You can use a touchscreen with taps, long taps, gestures. Again, many new user experiences are built around touchscreens. That's completely fine. You can use voice. You can use voice commands, and that's all the rage as of late, with specifically formatted requests formulated to an always listening microphone. Think of Alexa, or think about Google Assistant. You give them commands and they respond. It's easy as that. Or you can use a keyboard with shortcuts and specifically formatted requests formulated to an always listening text input. Otherwise, this is known as a command line interface. Same thing as a voice input, as a voice interface, except you have to type instead of speak. And even then, you can probably have like some kind of voice to text software, and you can probably use the terminal just by speaking. See what I'm doing here? Interacting with the computer with commands might be different from what Windows, Apple, and Android users are used to, but it's far from being difficult. Manual pages are a thing. Cheat sheets are a thing. Web search is a thing and has been a thing for quite a while. So you can just Google away how to do some things, Google away how to use some command line software. It's pretty easy. And I find myself having to Google away how to use graphical software that I'm not familiar with instead of terminal software. For terminal software, I can just open a manual page. So I would even argue that using terminal software is typically easier. Or you can just, I don't know, if you try to use sed, you can just run sed --help and you probably get a pretty helpful little synopsis of the command that you're trying to use. You can create aliases if you fancy. I use ripgrep instead of grep, but my muscle memory tells me to write grep every time I have to search for something. I use neovim, but instead of typing nvim, because that's dumb, I just type vim, because I have an alias for that. Let me think about other aliases. I don't know, I have an alias called whoowns that calls the command pacman-QO, because I don't always remember QO, and that I need that to know which package owns a certain file in my system. Very customizable, very user-friendly, because you can call whatever function, you can call it whatever, and you can also create functions or scripts for more complicated stuff. So it's even easier than using a graphical user interface in many aspects. Of course, it really depends on what you're doing. One example that comes to mind for something that is easier or more intuitive with the terminal is package updates and package management in general. I think that having, it's just more intuitive in my opinion, because you do, I don't know, if you're on Debian or Ubuntu, you do apt search and a name of a package, and you find all the packages with that name or with that particular word in the name. Or you do apt install, or well, if you move to pacman, of course commands get a little bit confusing because you have single letter options that are combined together. So arguably using pacman before you used to how it works, it's not really all that intuitive. But if you're using something like apt or dnf or flatpak or snap, because they are package managers that you can use from the command line as well, it's pretty intuitive, and more intuitive than using a GUI, because instead of telling the computer what you want to do, you have to look in the screen for what you're trying to do and try to find something that gets close to what you're trying to do. It makes sense to me to use the terminal for package management. Also, having a log right in front of me in case that something goes wrong, I think that's incredibly valuable. And some software stores are able to give you some sort of log if something goes wrong, but it's not always the case. Plus, there are some things that are warnings that are not really errors that you would not see typically on a graphical package manager. Like, for instance, if you have a conflicting configuration file, your graphical package manager probably would fail to tell you that. Or if you have, I don't know, yeah, conflicting configuration files is probably one of the things that that always happens to me, and always happens in any distribution. I think any software distribution system out there has this kind of problem. Another problem that I can think of that isn't typically shown in graphical package managers is when there are permission mismatches. And that's one thing that could cause potentially security issues. So if you run an update and the new package has different permissions compared to what you have in your system, it means that either you have to change that manually if you understand what the permission change means, and if you realize that it makes sense to make this permission change, because it may differ depending on your use case. Then you do it. But in a graphical package manager, you typically don't see these changes, and you probably don't care to go and look for it's not feasible for you to go and look for every package if they have permission changes. It's much more convenient if the package manager tells you about it, and most package managers do. It's just that most of the time you don't see their messages. Another very fitting example that I can think of is FFmpeg. There are countless front ends for FFmpeg, but the sheer number of features and options that you can use makes every front end, in my opinion, either lacking that particular feature you need, or more complicated than using the command line version in the first place. You probably understand what I'm trying to say here. There's always a right tool for the job, and sometimes we have to accept it. Sometimes that right tool is a terminal. It just makes sense because it's another way to interact with your computer. You wouldn't draw you wouldn't do a digital drawing with a mouse or, God forbid, a keyboard. At the same time, you wouldn't do complex string search or manipulation or package management or use FFmpeg or other software. You wouldn't do it with a mouse. It's just not the right tool for the job. You need a keyboard, you need commands. Those are the right tools for the job. And people need to start understanding that when we Linux users tell other new Linux users or potential new Linux users to open up a terminal and type this down, we are doing it because it's the most logical way in our opinion. So if I tell a Linux using friend, open the terminal and type this, it's because I think this is the best way to do the job. At the same time, it's easier to instruct someone else to write down a command than it is to instruct them on how to use or where to click. So there's also that. And the other thing is that in general, I think that, well, in my experience, the people that I know that use Linux, they are not as technically minded as I am. Even if they do not use the terminal on a daily basis or are not really familiar with it, they're not intimidated by it. At least the people I know, they are smart enough to not be intimidated by it. They understand that for some things, it makes sense. That if you're trying to do something like something advanced or something where you need a lot of control, it does make sense to use a terminal. And this is, in my opinion, what the Linux community has to accept. It's not like using the terminal is bad. Terminal bad is something that we've always tried to work on. We've always tried to remove the terminal from our lives, and we haven't really ever succeeded in doing that because it's not possible. We have a very powerful tool, and there is no way that we're getting rid of it because it's, again, a very powerful tool for many jobs. It's not the best tool for every job. Again, if you're drawing, if you're doing graphic design, if you're doing video editing, it's probably better to use a graphical user interface. But if you're doing bulk operation, converting lots of files in bulk, or scripting something, or grabbing for some text and putting it into another text file, the terminal is probably the best tool for the job. And we are incredibly lucky to have the possibility to use both great terminal applications and great graphical applications on Linux, because other operating systems out there do not really have this privilege. Because if you think about Android, you do have some sort of terminals, but they're very limited on what they can do. If you think about macOS, you do have some sort of terminal, but if you really want to install some very powerful utilities, you need to use brew, and that's not really all that easy, particularly for again, not non-technically minded people. It's not easy to operate something like brew. And on Windows, I don't even know how to install command line software on Windows. Well, I kind of do, but it's a mess and it's broken and it doesn't really work most of the time, and you have to navigate through configuration panels to add something to your path, and that's just a mess. So that's all I wanted to say about command line. Command line isn't hard. CLI isn't hard. CLI is a tool, and as for every tool, it is valuable, and it's nice that we have the possibility to use it. All right, guys, with this, I'm going to wrap it up for today's episode of the Tech Pills live stream. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone that could make it for the live stream and for the interactions. If you like this video, please make sure to press the thumbs up button down there. Also, remember to subscribe to my channel if you want more of this. And also remember to join the Tech Pills community at techpills.technology/community or using one of these nice QR codes on my left. Yes, that's the left. You can join the Telegram channel, the Telegram group, or the Matrix room, or you can also join the Discord server. All of these communication channels are bridged together using Matrix. So no matter what your preferred chat application is, you will be able to communicate and get in touch with the whole Tech Pills community. All right, guys, thank you again very much for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.